Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I am Abe with Mystic Gen Mara. I am a small town mystic from the middle of Idaho, and tonight I plan on introducing you guys to something that I have been thinking about building for a while now, and I decided to start with probably one of the first topics that I ever learned about along this subject anyway, and that is, make sure I got my notes here. I'm only working from one screen and it's not a very big one compared to some of the other streamers that I've followed. This is a series that I want to start doing, and I've got a couple of names that I'm gonna play with over the next few weeks, deciding on which name to stick with. And I'd like to do this as a weekly stream, either Mondays or Thursdays. I haven't decided yet. And it'll be either every week or every other week. It's going to be a once a week thing because there's a lot of planning that goes into this particular type of project. There we go. And my plan is to introduce you to some of the historical figures in various spiritual and religious groups. I plan on talking about who they were, and if I can, the time they lived. There's a few of these people who, for some odd reason, history has chosen to lose parts of their lives, so that made it really interesting. So I'm going to keep this as non-biased as I can, but understanding that I am human, so there will be times when my own opinions about some of these interesting characters will come forward. I will try to note when my opinions are coming forward, mainly because I don't want to taint anyone's opinions of what's happening, because, you don't want to do that. So, let me check one thing here real quick. There we go. And feel free during the stream to comment. I've got windows up everywhere. So if you have comments or questions, go ahead and drop them as we go. And there. So tonight I'm going to introduce you to the Fox sisters. If you haven't heard about them, they're an interesting cast of characters. The sisters were named Leah, the oldest, by like 20 years older than the other two. Margareta, or Maggie, is how she was usually called. And then Catherine, or Kate, or Katie. It kind of depended on who was talking to her as to which name she took. These were the three sisters from New York State. And our story begins in 1848, when Catherine, and I'm going to put this out there, ages are variable because it depended on who they were talking to and which report you were reading. I've went over this for 2 days now, and I have found ages from Catherine, or Kate, starting out as young as 9, and Maggie as young as 12. But the more common answer, meaning it was in several of the texts, was in 1848. Catherine was 11, and Margareta, was 14. At this time, they were the youngest of 6 children. The oldest ones, from what I could find, the oldest 2 siblings for sure, which was Leah and David, they were already moved out of the house. And there were 2 others, but they weren't really mentioned anywhere. They weren't really important to the story, so there's that. But at this time, in 1848, they were living in Hydesville, New York. It's a town that doesn't exist anymore, so you can look if you want, but it doesn't exist. It was outside of Newark, so that might help at least find a location. Leah, as I said, was older and out of the house. She was living the married life in Rochester, New York. And, being that she was 20 years or so older than Kate and Maggie. So the youngest of 6 children, the 2 girls were living with their Methodist parents, John and Margaret. From everything I've read, they were on the poor side of life. So they lived where they could. So with that in mind, they were renting a house that had a reputation of being haunted. The story begins. Local lore said that there had been a murder within the house, and not everyone had left with their own body. Well, let's just start there. And apparently nothing too creepy had started really until March of 1848. Several of the references said that they moved into the house in 45 to 46. They moved from Canada down. There was some drama within mom and dad's world at that point, having to do with alcohol, which plays prominently later on in the story too. And this is where things start to get interesting. In this time period, in March of 1848, the family started to be frightened, primarily Margaret, the mother, by noises and the apparent movement of furniture and other items around their house. Mind you, they were poor, so there wasn't a lot there, but things were just starting to not add up. The noises started as the young girls playing a trick on their mom. And we're going to give a little disclaimer right here. I'm going to give away this part right now, and then we'll go into a little bit more of some of the theories later on. So the girls started playing games on their mother. They wanted to trick her. It was that dark. What do kids have to do? My argument against this is if you're talking a 9 to 12-year-old or even 11 to 14-year-old, I question whether this was even possible. That's my opinion. What they were doing is according to Maggie, we'll get into that, but they would take an apple on a string and bounce it behind their bed on the floor while their mother was downstairs. Their mother, Margaret, not thinking that that her dearest daughters would ever be smart enough to pull off a stunt or trick her. They're 11 and 14. They're not that smart. They continued to do this night after night after night, which obviously spooked their mother significantly. You're in a house that the neighbors keep saying is haunted, and now you start having noises. Over time, and this is within a week or so, this went on every single night, sometimes all night long, according to the records, which is why I personally have a theory that there might have been some playing to start with, but something else woke up at the same time, my opinion. But over time, the mother started to ask the spirit questions, to which the girls, with their various taps and bumps, which they would call the rappings, would answer these questions. The spirit would answer yes and no questions. It could spell via different bumps and scrapes, similar to Morse code. Over time, it was discovered that the young girls were mediums within the house. They were communicating with a spirit that Maggie, and she's the one who picked this name, the oldest of the two, called Mr. Splitfoot, which is entertaining when during that time period, Mr. Splitfoot was a name for the devil because of the imagery of the devil as a cloven-hoofed demon coming to get you. But they also started to reference, and who initiated this name, it's unclear, but one of the two girls came up with this name, that the spirit that was talking to them was a dead man, the murdered victim, by the name of Charles B. Rosna. There's a couple of variations of the last name because it was handwritten in cursive, so it could be Rosna, it could be Rosno, it could be Rosma. Pick one. But it was Charles B. Rosna is the one that I'm going with. They claimed that this was the dead man that had been murdered in the house. And they made the rather audacious claim that the person was actually buried in the basement of the house that they were living in. Yeah, fun place. Murders. Now we got a dead body hidden somewhere in the house. Well, the neighbors who were convinced the house was haunted to begin with didn't want to come around. When they started hearing about this Charles B. Rosna that was buried in the basement, suddenly everyone had a shovel and they were willing to help. So over the course of a day or two, they tore up the entire basement, quite a few feet deep. It was a dirt basement, And they did, oddly enough, find some bones, little tufts of hair, and for them, that was evidence the girls were correct. But the references to the bones and hair were very loose to start with, so the people who were less superstitious had less of a theory about that, or less of belief in the girls at that point. But because they did find bones and they did find some hair, the town folk scoured the area trying to figure out who had lived in the house as many years back as they could before the Fox family moved in. And they eventually found a man who they thought had murdered Charles B. Rosna because he'd lived in that house at a time. Full disclosure, whether or not Charles ever existed is unknown. It's suspected that he never did. As the girls' lives went on, people started to, talk like they do. And there was never enough concrete evidence to prove that this person ever existed. There's no historical record. There's nothing from that time period of this person. But you also have to remember, back in the 1800s, some people were born and never were recorded. So there's a lot of ifs in this story. It's old. So during the time when this is happening, and I didn't realize there was this much going on. This was some things that I pulled up just because I was like, whoa, I didn't know this. During this shift, this 1840s to 50s era, there's a shift going on, primarily in the United States, but also worldwide. And the shift was... Sorry, I totally wrote the wrong word in here. I have notes, and I know I'm going to mess this up if I don't change this right now. So, there's a big shift in religion in this time period. People were pulling away from the Stoic Catholicism and the Methodists and a lot of the Quakers and things like that of the time, who were very strict. This is how we are. And people were starting to pull away from that. And oddly enough, this is when several other religions were being birthed. Especially in the area of New York, in particular, Mormonism was being pretty much discovered, founded, built in during this time period. And Millerism, which doesn't, to my knowledge, I couldn't find references to true Millerite churches today. There might be a few that are, offsprings. But Millerism was actually the precursor that eventually became the Seventh-day Adventist church, which I'm very familiar with, which I didn't realize that they were all within the area of the Fox sisters. So this is all happening in this 1840s, 1850s time period. Energy healing was coming forward as an alternative to the snake oil salesman at the time, and altered states of consciousness were also being researched, discovered, developed. People who were really listening to and reading the ideas of Sweden's Emanuel Swedenborg, who was, I believe, in the 1700s, and the Australian Franz Anton Mesmer. Both of these guys' ideas were becoming extremely popular during this time period as well. Swedenborg had a very unique view of how we live, how the spirits live, the different layers of reality, and a lot of what we have today came from his research. We've expanded massively, but it comes from his research. And then the Franz Anton Mesmer was someone who believed that the human body, because of being mostly fluid and also had some magnetic power, the body could be hypnotized, the physical body could be hypnotized and healed. So you'd still be awake and conscious and normal, but your body would be under a hypnotic trance. And these were things that were really starting to hit the American shores during this time period, and people were eating it up. They were all about it. Sorry, my ears started ringing. So during this time, what these girls started doing was actually huge. And it was transformational. Everything was being turned upside down as far as religion and people's beliefs and things like that. So this was a lot for the small family. I mean, this is just huge. Altogether, chaos. And the girls were eventually sent away from the home. They were split up. At one point in time, one sister went to live with their older sister, Leah. Reports vary as to which girl went which direction. The other sister, and this is where it gets jumbled again, either went to live with their older brother, David, or a journalist. Again, reports are really inconsistent, so I don't know which girl went where. But this was only for a short period of time, except for the daughter that stayed with the journalist. And I believe that was Kate. And we'll go into a little bit more of her stuff real quick, if I can find it. So anyway, I thought I had it. I thought I had it written down. I didn't. But Kate, when she was with the journalist for a time period, he was a skeptic, 100% skeptic. So he had tested her in a massive amount of ways in the short period of time that she lived with him. And even after she moved out, he continued to work and test and prove her to see if she was actually a medium or not. And he was pretty much convinced that she was guaranteed genuine. There was no question in his mind that Kate was a 100% medium, full body physical type medium. So, and this all happened when these girls were all under the age of 15, or Kate and Maggie were both under the age of 15. These were young kids. And for them to be able to do what's being claimed by that they could do, kids during this time period didn't have the type of technology advancement to do this. So that's the reason I say there's some questions as to whether it was real or not. But after they moved away from the haunted house, guess what? The wrappings followed them, obviously, because I just talked about the journalist. But it doesn't appear to have stayed at home with the parents. Once the girls moved out, Mom and Dad didn't have any more issues. Suspicious? Maybe. But it gets worse, or better, depending on how you look at it. Reports of doors slamming, tables tipping randomly. Just by having one of the girls in the room, this stuff would happen. Chairs that seemed to be glued to the floor, no matter how strong of a man could try to lift it, couldn't pick it up. And random ghost touches, those faint little touches that you turn around thinking there's someone there and there wasn't. And with Kate in particular, there were claims that musical instruments would play around her without hands, like harpsichords and the piano type. I just lost the name of them. But these different instruments and violins and even whatever she happened to be around would just randomly start to play without anyone touching it. Kate was the one that was tested the most frequently according to the documents that I could find, and the results that came back time and time and time again was that she was a medium and she was one of the strongest that even the skeptics had ever seen. And she was like 9, 10 around this time period, so maybe 11. So I mean, there's that window of time, but that's pretty impressive that someone that young could do that. Anyway, and this is where hindsight becomes clearer than when it was actively happening. So this gets messy through here, because a lot of what was written about the girls from reporters came after the fact. There was reports of things going on during their time, but it was so tweaked and garbled over the years that it's basically turned into a big hit piece across the board. It's interesting. Anyway, so once the girls started, both of them actually ended up living with Leah at one point. And during that time period, Isaac and Amy Post, who play a good foundation in how this all basically blew up, because at the time it was pretty much within Hinesville and maybe with their sister Leah. No one else really knew about it outside their really small community. But this is where Isaac and Amy Post come in. They were longtime friends of the Fox family. They were friends with both of their parents, had known them for years, they grew up together type thing. They were what was classified in multiple sources as a radical couple in the radical Quaker community. It took me a minute to figure out why they kept referencing the Quaker community as radical. During the time, the way they worshipped was mind-blowing to people. So a lot of that, they just were classified as they're radical, they're out there. So it kind of fit in with what we got going on. So Isaac and Amy decided that they were going to test these girls to find out if they were actually talking to spirits or they were charlatans. Yeah, preteen kids are charlatans. So when they tested the girls, the rapping that they heard, which was knocks on the floor, knocks on the wall, the chairs they were sitting in, that the other people were sitting in started to shake, were so intense that it convinced this Quaker couple that they were genuine in all aspects. And they were the ones that started to really spread the word amongst the Quaker community and the outlying towns that these girls were communicating with spirits. Eventually, this led to the development of the group with the title called Spiritualist, the Spiritualist churches and things like that. It actually developed out of the Quaker community. Because Isaac and Amy Post were the ones that thrust these girls into the spotlight. They were this was about mid-1894, or 1849. Must be dyslexic tonight. And during this time, so this is about a little over a year and a half after the first incident. And Isaac and Amy had been testing these kids repeatedly, taking them around, showing little to small groups. But it was in mid-November of 1849 in the Corinthian Hall in Rochester where this was the first public showing of what these two children could do. According to the research, this is the first time that ever in this country, United States, that there was a paid public psychic event. Now you can go to them anywhere almost in the country. Every state's got something. They're pretty common now, but during this time period in mid-November of 1849, this was the very first time where you could go as a group, not just in someone's seance hall in their house, but at an actual performing hall and experience psychic metaphysic type event. By the 1850s, the girls were doing shows and readings in New York for a variety of very important people for the time, some very famous, some very notorious. A lot of the sessions were frivolous, where people were talking about, oh, where am I going to find love? Or, I need to know what the stock market's going to do tomorrow. But eventually, what they were doing developed into something far more spiritual. And it aligned with the concept of channeling and spiritual communication, but it went from being kind of a parlor trick to being something a lot more serious. One of the people who were drawn to the girls, and this one was weird to me because his history doesn't really start very well, and I'll probably cover him later because he's kind of an odd duck. But one of the people that was drawn to them was a seer, so a soothsayer, named Andrew Jackson Davis, who during this time period ended up being called the John the Baptist of modern spiritualism. So he was kind of the one out there making noise, getting people prepared for the spiritual stuff to happen. And because of this contact with these girls and his belief, very strong belief, that they were actually making communication, he was recognized very quickly as the leader of the modern movement of spiritualism. What's fascinating to people at the time is that they could commune with the realm of spirit without having to communicate through a pastor, a priest, go through this huge ritual of lighting candles and the communion. People were tired of that, which I make no judgment. I walked away from a lot of the trappings years ago. But this was the reason that a lot of this spiritual revolution was happening with these different groups. It was, you have the right and the ability to commune directly with the spirit world, is what they called it, but you could call it the divine or whatever. But this was helping people begin to believe that they could have an open door to God, source, divine energy. They could talk to their own angels, etc. And they became more of an active participant in their own salvation, versus having to go to the church to be absolved of their sins, or going through these different rites. Like a lot of the monasteries, you'd see the monks going upstairs on their knees as penance for some made-up sin. And so during this time period, these people were like, wait, I have a say? I can talk to God myself. I don't need someone else to do it for me. And so they really started getting into this. And to be honest with you, and this is the foundation of like Mormonism and Adventism and a few of these other isms, some of the stuff that came out of this time period that I feel is good across the board, everybody should be happy with this, was that we all do actually have the right and the ability to talk to the divine on our own. It's in the Bible, it's in multiple alternative religious texts going back 5,000 years. It all talks about we have that right. It's only been in the last 2,000 years or so where there's been a stranglehold placed on us where you can't talk to God unless you go through this channel. That changed so drastically during this time period, this 1840s, 50s period. But as always happens with anything that somebody's doing that might be real, you started to get the people imitating the girls. But at that time, none could come close to the popularity of the Fox sisters, which was a lot of it was because of Leah. Their older sister Leah, their senior from the beginning of the story, she became their manager early on, just after Isaac and Amy got the first show going and Leah saw dollar signs. There's not a lot of good written about Leah because of how she was viewed to have literally sold her younger sisters so that she could have a comfortable life. Everything written about her is dirty, like really dirty. But she became their manager, and because of that, all three of them prospered because the girls were living with Leah at the time. But they prospered in this new light, and she was definitely shining the light on them. But she started her own little side business as well. So they started a journey, if you call it, or a professional tour is what we call it today, of spreading the word of the spiritual world. These kids are not that old. They booked a suite in the Barnum Hotel towards the beginning of their fame, and Leah, the eldest, remained in New York practicing seances. But the Barnum Hotel was the start of many, many years of almost daily shows somewhere in the country. And most of what they did, the young girls, because Leah stayed in New York, they had a manager with them that she'd cleared. I just had an alert pop up, sorry. They were traveling, Maggie and Katie were traveling a grand tour of the East Coast. They were going to places like Cleveland, Ohio, Columbus, Washington, D.C., even as far as St. Louis. They were all over the place, and they were basically constantly in a state of travel during this. And there's not an exact date on this, so I can't give you how old these girls were. I'm assuming by the time periods that are referenced around this event. Now my phone's going off. Why? The time period around this event was, I'm going to say, 1865-ish to 1870 is around the time this all went on. Because at this point, things start happening quick. In Philadelphia, Maggie would meet her future husband, explorer Elisha Kent Kane. He was a Antarctica explorer, is what he was referenced as. Kane was charmed by the girls' show, but was adamant, without a doubt, none questioning, that they were frauds. He never could prove it. He tried everything. He was probably one of the biggest skeptics, but he was so ensnared, or bewitched, if you will, by Maggie that he just couldn't let her go. No matter how much he thought what they were doing was wrong, he had fallen head over heels for Maggie. His family was furious. He didn't care. And it took him years, literally, there are references to as long as 5 years of him pursuing her and her pretty much being like, get off me, to basically be with him, to marry him, to whatever. He finally convinces her, in the late 1860s sometime is what it looks like, to stop doing seances, stop doing anything psychic, just quit all of it, just knock it off. As basically his way of saying thank you for that, he put her entirely through school, never could find out exactly what for, probably just so she'd be an educated person, honestly. And once she went through school, he was finally able to, sources here are mixed because this is Maggie's word, not the family's, but after she graduated, he finally convinced her to marry him, and they apparently, from what Maggie has said about this, they had a quiet ceremony. I couldn't find a record, to be honest with you, of a marriage certificate, but if you were married in one of the churches at the time, there wouldn't have been a marriage certificate per se, so who knows. But what was interesting is shortly after they were officially married, he dies, leaving her alone again. And when he passed, she converted to Catholicism after her Presbyterian and not Catholic husband had made her promise to convert to Catholicism after he died. That was a weird request, just across the board, to me. And his death, though, really troubled Maggie because he'd been such an integral part of her life for so long, even though they weren't really married, and she was kind of like, go away. According to a lot of reports, it was shortly after his death that she was so distraught and so troubled over this, it led her back into, even though she converted to Catholicism, she went back to a lot of her mediumship ways, not like she was before, but she started back into it. And she also picked up the bad habit that caused her parents issues. She became an alcoholic, and we're not talking a little bit. It was bad. And she off and on during this time period, like I said, different sources have different information. When just after he died, she supposedly vowed to wholly and forever abandon spiritualism, but it wasn't very long after he died she was back involved in it. So, like I said, a lot of questions, but that's the reason I started with this one, because it's one that's kind of fun but not too heavy, and there's a lot of rabbit holes you can literally dive down. If you're really into digging through the Fox sisters, there's so much random information, and honestly, no two articles and no two reports are the same. So, Kate did also, eventually down the road, years, get married. Her husband was a spiritualist, and from reports, again, differing reports, he was either a banker or some kind of an investor because he was massively wealthy. And he encouraged her mediumship abilities and powers. He supported her financially in any endeavor she wanted to do in this realm. And over time, and this is where Kate has always been the stronger of the two, she had developed new ways to channel. Because up until this point, when they were together, the sisters, it was pretty much the knocking, the rapping, and a little bit of physical channeling. Kate was always stronger. It wasn't super elaborate. But it was said that Kate could channel 2 spirits, and some reports say 3, although their sources for those are questionable, but for sure she could do 2 at the same time. The 2 spirit channeling would be speaking a message to somebody while her hand was off beside her where she couldn't see it, automatic writing the next one. The report that talked about the 3rd is that there was someone that could decipher the tapping sounds, and while she was channeling verbally and she was automatic writing, the rapping would be going on as well, and so you'd have three different forms of communication. So it's up to you whether you believe there was three or just the two. I personally feel, my opinion, that it was just the two at the same time. But she also had a weird channeling ability with her automatic writing that baffled people. And if you've never tried it, it's extremely difficult. I've tried it just because of mainly this. But she could write in reverse, but it wasn't just like writing backwards. It was mirrored. So the only way to actually be able to read those messages was to hold them up to a light and look through the light, or hold it up to a mirror so you could get the mirrored image of it. These were not normal things, and she developed this when she was very young. 17, 18, 19 is when this started to manifest. And other times, they would be testing her, and they would be holding both of her hands, and the tester would have his feet on top of hers, and talking to her, and there'd be various articles on tables around the room, and they would have lots of witnesses, and words would just appear on pages. To me, there were parts of this that made me think it was the old lemon juice on paper trick. You get it warmed up and the words show up. But the way the witnesses that saw this stuff happening, I question it, because there was one witness, and she was a female, and she was a huge skeptic, which her and her husband actually developed an entire skeptic association later on. But she went here to one of these events, and she took a blank piece of paper and put it on one of these tables when Kate was being tested. And she said the one thing that made her the most confused was how that word got on that paper, because the paper was one that she brought from home, and she placed there, but there was writing on that page, and it was legible. She could read it, and she watched no one touched it. So that's the reason that there's a lot of suspicion as to whether these kids were genuine or not. There's a lot of witnesses that say that there might have been more going on there than what people realized. So now we're getting into an interesting time period, because around the time that Maggie gets married, the mid-1860s or so, was during and just after the Civil War in the United States. Business was booming, especially for Kate. Let me grab a drink. The families that had lost loved ones turned to spiritualism for comfort. The comfort that you would receive from the churches was at best at that time, so people really wanted to be able to communicate with their loved ones, and so spiritualism was the next path for them. During this time period, the early 1860s, the movement went from a few hundred people to well over 2 million followers during this time period. There are reports as high as 5 million people worldwide had finally gotten into this movement. Again, unconfirmed, because they didn't have records like we do today. That's a rough estimation. Which this explosion and this growth and this constantly being busy was great, but not for Kate. She was becoming exhausted, like worn out. This type of work, if you've ever done any form of anything metaphysical, it will drain you over time if you're not taking the breaks. And because the money was really good, Kate didn't stop. And Kate had compassion, so she wanted to help people. And in her mind, what she was doing was helping people. Not so much Maggie, but that was Kate. It was said that she could get to a point where she could summon full apparitions. And full apparitions as in ectoplasm, physical apparitions where the loved one would come in and they could see them. Things that are kind of laughed at today, but there were skeptics, there were reporters, there were important businessmen that had been in the room and actually had interactions with these apparitions when she would summon them, and there was no explanation for it, and it scared some of the people so bad that they swore up and down that whatever she was doing was real and they didn't want to deal with her. The thing with the summoning of full apparitions, this would wear Kate out massively. And her exhaustion was so bad that she couldn't sleep. It was said that she stopped eating at points. And to help herself get to sleep, she turned to the same thing that Maggie and her dad had done. She began to drink, and drink heavily. And she was not that old when she started into the heavy alcohol aspect, like mid-30s maybe. And during that time period, just after the Civil War, they were just busy. They were doing their spiritual stuff. Maggie had stopped doing most of it, and Leah was still doing her scam on the side. And at one point, Kate had ended up moving to the UK. Mainly just the stress of everything. It was quieter over there. She could still practice, but it wasn't as intensive as it was in this country. But in October of 1888, and this is where a lot of the doubt and skepticism really got anchored in, at least as far as I'm concerned. In the October of 1888, an interview was published in one of the New York newspapers, in which Maggie Fox said that she would make an appearance at the New York Academy of Music. This appearance, she was paid $1,500 for during that time, which is a massive amount of money. Massive amount of money. But it was during this appearance, she would publicly come out and denounce all spiritualism, and she would demonstrate by showing how they were able to make rapping sounds, at least in the beginning. She attacked her older sister, Leah. Like I said, Leah had some nasty, nasty things. She was it almost was like she was hateful towards her younger siblings because of the popularity that they had received, and she was out to get them, basically. And so this was kind of a slapback for Maggie. Maggie attacked Leah at this performance in 1888 for exploiting the younger sisters, and literally the girls did all the work, but Leah kept all the money. Maggie claimed that Leah knew from the beginning that everything was a scam, and she was so greedy that she just kept pushing the girls to keep going, and then actually started doing her own thing as on top of it. The problem with this was Katie came, and there's differing reports. Some people say she came to support Maggie. Other people said she was coming to support her sister even though she didn't agree with it. Again, there's so many random conflicting stories around this time. But this situation in 1888 led to more heartache for poor Maggie. Around a year after the denouncement, she was broke. She had nothing. She was losing her house. So she recanted the denouncement, said that she lied about the whole thing. She was paid to say it, which she probably was, and claimed that her guides told her to denounce it, wait a little while, and then pop back in to shake up the movement and keep going. The problem was the spiritualists of that time, which was a huge community, they turned on her. They basically were kicking her out of the club. She tried to expose the charlatans, because she could actually figure out what was going on, by using a fake name, and she exposed a massive amount of secrets of the trade in different articles around the eastern United States in different newspapers. And the only reason that they found out that she was the one that had been writing them is after she'd passed in some of her journals. She referenced, "Today I wrote a letter as so-and-so exposing," so there was some records of it. But just before this all happened, when Kate was still living in the UK, she actually had 2 sons. And during this time period, and this is the reason that she ended up in the UK, Leah had been causing a lot of chaos in Kate's life because Kate lost her husband as well. And because of all the nonsense going on with Leah, she almost lost her kids. Well, Kate was drinking very heavily, and so Leah knew that that was a way to control Kate, was to get the kids. Over time, Kate ended up in the UK. Maggie went to the UK. They were both over there for a period of time before Maggie came back. From what it looks like, Maggie came back before Kate, but they eventually ended up both back in New York. And it was just after they returned to New York that Maggie did her denouncement and the drama that followed. But this story, nothing about this story, and I didn't realize how depressing it was until I started really digging into it, because I learned about it when I was like in high school, so this was a long time ago. A couple of years. We won't talk about how many. Maggie and Leah never fixed anything. Kate and Leah never fixed anything. Leah pretty much burnt her bridge with her siblings at this point. It was referenced at one point that no other living relative would have anything to do with Leah after that denouncement. So it looks like Leah kind of burnt every bridge she had available to her. That being said, Leah Fox died in 1890. So just 2 years after Maggie came out and made her denouncement, Leah died at the age of approximately 77 to 80. Again, ages were weird. Kate, unfortunately, drank herself to death in 1892. She was around 57-ish, 57 to 59. Maggie passed away just over a year later in March of 1893. Also from alcoholism. They said it was a cardiac arrest or something like that, but she was a heavy alcoholic in the end of her days, so there's a lot of correlation there. But oddly enough, in 1893, the spiritualists formed their first official group called the National Spiritualist Association. At a later time, I believe it was in the early 1900s, like 1905 to 6, somewhere in there, this group eventually became the National Spiritualist Association of Churches. They actually developed the first spiritualist church. What was really sad about reading through a lot of this stuff is Kate and Maggie started with nothing, had an immaculate life where they actually developed what we'd call today upper middle class finances. They were making some good money at one point in time. But when they died, they both died in abject poverty. Maggie died staying at a friend's house, and Kate was, I can't remember where Kate was, but it was a hovel basically. She'd been moving couch to couch type of a thing. But they both died with nothing. After everything that they'd went through, all of the stress and the kind of elaborate life that they'd live, extravagant, they died with nothing. And the sad part to me, probably the worst part about it, was they died bound to a bottle that they drowned their memories in. They didn't want to remember, they couldn't handle some of the things that had happened in their life, and so they drank. Skeptics believed that their entire mediumship was based on being double jointed in their feet and lower legs. Well, we're going into a little bit of some of the realism here. By popping or cracking or thumping, learning to thump some of these joints onto the ground, they would create the wrapping. Maggie claimed it started with an apple on a string, as I explained in the beginning, that they would hide behind their bed, because they shared a bed, they were, poor, and they would drop the string with the apple on it, and this apple would bounce on the floor. And their mom would actually come in the room, and she wouldn't see that they were bouncing this apple underneath the bed. She couldn't figure out where the noise was coming from. This was Maggie's story. It was creating these spooky sounds where they would thud and it would echo. But the neighbors that would come over to the house in those early days before they went to live with Leah, the girls did, said that the house shook with the sound. You're not doing that with an apple. And these are grown men. They're not going to be like, well, that sounds like a rat. The house shook with the sound was quoted in every article in the beginning of their life. Whether or not it started out as a gag and turned into something else, I don't know. But there's some of this part of it with what Maggie was trying to denounce it with that it just sounds lame. Sorry, that's just my opinion. It started with the apple on the string, and eventually the girls learned how to crack and pop joints in their lower legs and feet that would create the thumping sounds. Maggie claimed, and a lot of the denouncement and the exposing the fraud came from Maggie herself, and so how much of it you want to believe is up to you, but Maggie claimed that Kate could do the same popping, thumping, carrying on noises with her hands, and she could actually had trained herself to make even more unique sounds by simply flexing muscles in her hands, and it would make these supposedly room-shaking noises. Maggie claimed, for not being a medical of any form, claimed that they had learned how to manipulate what we would call the tarsals in the foot, the bones that go down to your toes. She claims that they had been able to figure out how to manipulate them like fingers and could thump them on the ground loud enough to rattle the windows. When I first read that part of her denouncement, I did some digging, and I could find no proof that such a thing was possible. Not to make that loud of noises, where they could be on the stage in a great hall with 150 people in it, and the person outside the back doors could hear the noise of them thumping. There were other people who believed that they were stomping their feet underneath their dresses, and they just learned to manipulate their legs so that you wouldn't see the dress moving. This was all stuff that Maggie had proposed or suggested during her big denouncement. The part that is weird about this is over the years, the girls were tested frequently, and it was always someone who didn't believe anything that they talked about or did. And there were skeptics everywhere during that time, especially religious leaders were like, "You're faking this." The weird part about it is the only proof of fraud or dishonesty was from Maggie. That was it. There was no evidence, no medical evidence, no religious evidence, no spiritual evidence, nothing that said these girls were not capable, especially Kate. The only evidence was Maggie's confession, which a year later she recanted because the spirits told her to get back into the swing of things. Kate was always the more powerful of the two sisters, no matter what reference I read about it, being the youngest. It was said that she could, in a controlled environment, doors locked, windows locked, people that the skeptic, the tester, had hand-selected each person to come into the room, and this was part of the testing and the controlling that they would do, and I have to say it was thorough. To come into the room, you were stripped naked, completely nude. You were physically searched, think cavity search, before your clothes were all checked, before you were allowed to be redressed and enter the room. This was a very controlled environment. The people testing were adamant that this was not going to be fraud. Kate could create sounds in the walls. She could create sounds outside the room. This was documented in multiple sources. Kate could channel in the multiple styles, as I referenced before, verbally, doing the rapping and the writing, if you believe she could do all three. She could conjure spirits into physical apparitions by sheer willpower, is one of the references. And things would manifest on and around her body, what we would call today ectoplasm. Documented. Skeptics couldn't figure out where this stuff was coming from, couldn't figure out why it was happening. And as much as they were despised by the skeptics, both of the girls were despised by the skeptics, no one could disprove what they were doing, especially Kate. Maggie, because of her shenanigans over her lifetime, she exposed, quote-unquote, herself, but not everything that even Maggie did was explainable through joints popping. So, after all of the criticism, the critique, the possibilities of yes, the possibilities of no, what do you think? Were the Fox sisters frauds? Were they fakes? Or were they really the first step in the next step in spirituality, in the spiritual movement? Were they the best tricksters of their time? Or were they, as Kate was especially referenced, the most powerfully tied person in mediumship at that time? What do you think? Let me know your thoughts below. I'm actually curious as to what you think about this, if you've ever heard of the Fox sisters or if this is your first taste. It's an odd rabbit hole to go down because it doesn't matter what you believe today. The time when you look at the evidence, you look at the testing that was done, which was scientific for the time, reference on that, it was unique. And when I was growing up, because of the way I was raised, I was always told that they were evil and they were vile and they did all these horrible things. But when I got older and I started really looking into it, like I said, I learned about them in high school, and I was always told they were bad, they were evil, didn't go into detail about their lives, didn't go into detail about them as people. But going over it for the last few days, trying to get everything sorted, because like I said, this is a series I want to start doing, is this type of stuff, I started figuring out that there was a lot more that went on with these two girls than people realized. Their lives were not their own. They were destroyed by their older sister. In some way you could blame the fault on the parents as well, because their mom and dad let them be drug around the country instead of putting a stop to basically parading their children around for a couple of pennies. They were treated very poorly in a lot of ways, even though they were also practically worshipped in other ways. But what do you think? Were they real? Were they frauds? But remember, when they started, they were kids. Kids being able to tell people their names, their ages, their family 3 and 4 generations back. How is a 9, 10, 11-year-old going to tell you, when they were poor and uneducated, your family 4 generations back when you probably didn't know it yourself? How is a 12 to 14-year-old telling you about issues in your own body that you haven't even figured out the name for yet? This was the stuff that they were doing when they were children. And they were exploited, abused, and possibly made into frauds because of it. Again, from what I could read, my opinion is still, I don't know. What do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. If you are new here and you like this type of video, please drop a like on the video, and if you enjoy this type of content, please subscribe. I will probably, this month is really chaos because I'm trying to do a video or a live every single day. This was a really long one for me, but I want to do this type of subject once a week, either Mondays or Thursdays. I haven't set an exact date yet. So give me ideas if you have any ideas of other people that you have heard about or maybe want to go over. I have a long list myself, so we'll see if we match up. But yeah, like, subscribe, comment if this is something you think someone else might want to be interested in or seeing. Please share the video. Oh, I forgot. I have a picture, one of the few pictures that I could find of the Fox sisters. So, I don't think my mouse will show up on the screen. Anyway, the one in the middle standing up was Kate, from what the references were saying. The little bit shorter one, looked a little more fill in the cheeks, is Leah, and the one where the Kate has her hand kind of cupped over is Maggie, from what the original descriptions were. But it was an interesting delve into something that I hadn't heard about or read about since I was very young. So hopefully that gave you guys a little bit of information as to kind of where things started in the States anyway. So with that, I will let you guys go and have a great evening, and I will talk to you again in a future video.